The courtroom doors opened and every head turned, not because anyone expected her, because everyone assumed she was dead. Eve Vega had been missing for 2 years. No phone calls, no emails, no sightings. Her apartment in Newark had been emptied. Her bank accounts were untouched. The police had classified her disappearance as a suspected homicide. Her family had held a memorial service. Her sister had packed her things into boxes, and now she was standing in the doorway of a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., thin, exhausted, and carrying 3 cardboard boxes. Eve Vega had been the chief accountant for Horton Development Group, a $5.1 billion real estate empire owned by a man named Callum Horton. She had managed the books for 7 years. She knew every account, every wire transfer, every shell company, every number that was supposed to stay hidden. And 2 years ago, she had discovered that Callum Horton was laundering $200 million through low-income housing projects funded by federal grants meant for the poorest neighborhoods in the country. She confronted him. He told her to forget what she saw. She didn't forget. She started copying files. 3 days later, a man from Horton's private security team showed up at her apartment. She ran. She vanished. For 2 years, she hid in places no billionaire's money could reach. Shelters, church basements, the spare bedrooms of strangers who asked no questions. She did not come back because it was safe. She came back because the evidence was complete. And the 3 boxes she carried into that courtroom contained everything. Bank records, wire transfers, shell companies, names, dates, amounts. 7 years of proof that the man sitting at the defense table had stolen $200 million from the people who needed it most. What happened next didn't just end a case, it ended an empire. And it began with a woman who chose to disappear so the truth could survive. Pause for 2 seconds and help me do something fun. Comment your city and country. I want to see how global this community really is. And I am looking for the 2 viewers watching the farthest apart today, so I can pin the winner. Now back to the story, because things are about to get very interesting. Eve Vega grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in East Orange, New Jersey. Her mother, Jenny Vega, worked as a school lunch server for 21 years. Her younger sister, Noor Vega, was a social worker in Patterson. They were not a family that had money. They were a family that counted it. Eve was good with numbers the way some people are good with music, not because she studied, but because she could hear when something was off. She graduated from Rutgers with a degree in accounting, passed the CPA exam on her first try, and spent 4 years at a mid-size firm in Newark before she was recruited by Horton Development Group at the age of 29. The salary was $142,000, more than her mother had earned in 4 years combined. Eve took it. She moved to a 1-bedroom apartment in Newark, sent money home every month, and buried herself in the numbers. Callum Horton was 58 years old. He owned the largest private real estate development company on the East Coast. His specialty was government-subsidized housing, apartment complexes, community centers, and mixed-use buildings funded by HUD grants and federal tax credits. He had developed projects in 14 states. He sat on 2 gubernatorial advisory boards. He donated to children's literacy programs and posed for photographs at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Behind the ribbon cuttings, the numbers told a different story. In her 3rd year, Eve noticed a pattern. Construction costs on Horton's low-income housing projects were consistently 40 to 60% higher than industry benchmarks. A building that should have cost $12 million to build was being invoiced at $19 million. The difference, $7 million, was flowing through a series of subcontractors Eve had never heard of. She pulled the subcontractor records. The companies were registered in Delaware. They had no employees, no physical addresses, no construction licenses. They were shells. Eve followed the money. It took her 4 months. She worked at night, at home, on a personal laptop that never connected to the company network. She tracked the payments through 3 layers of shell companies, across 2 offshore accounts, and back to a domestic trust controlled by Callum Horton. The laundered total over 5 years was approximately $200 million. Federal grant money intended for low-income housing, siphoned through fake construction invoices, washed through shells, and deposited into the personal wealth of a man who was already worth $5.1 billion. He wasn't stealing from a company. He was stealing from families, from neighborhoods, from buildings that were supposed to have working elevators and clean water and functioning heat. Eve made copies, not on the company system. She printed documents at a FedEx on Broad Street at 2 a.m. She saved wire transfer records onto encrypted USB drives. She built a spreadsheet cross-referencing every shell company, every invoice, every payment, and every project name. She stored everything in a fireproof safe she bought at Home Depot for $89 and kept under her bed. She told no one, not her mother, not Noor, not anyone. Until she made one mistake. She confronted Callum Horton. Subscribe now and stay to the end, because I am going to show you one thing Eve did before she vanished that nobody knew about, not even her own family, and when I reveal what she left behind, you will understand why this case was never about running. It was about timing. And her timing was perfect. It was a Friday evening. The office was empty. Eve walked into Callum Horton's corner office on the 22nd floor of Horton Tower in Jersey City. She carried a manila folder with 12 pages inside, a summary of the money trail she had built over 4 months. "Mr. Horton, I need to talk to you about the construction invoices on the Trenton project." Callum didn't look up from his computer. "What about them?" "The subcontractors listed on the invoices don't exist. The companies are Delaware shells. The payments cycle through 2 offshore accounts and return to a trust in your name." Now he looked up. "I've documented $200 million in laundered federal grant money across 14 projects over 5 years, Eve continued. "I have the wire transfers, the invoices, and the shell company registrations." The office went silent. Callum studied her face the way a man studies a lock he needs to pick. Then he leaned back. "Eve, you're a talented accountant. You've been very valuable to this company, but I think you've been working too hard. What you're describing is a misunderstanding of complex multi-entity accounting structures. It's not a misunderstanding." "Then let me be clear." His voice dropped. Not louder, quieter. The kind of quiet that comes before something dangerous. "These files don't leave this building. You don't discuss them with anyone. And tomorrow morning, you and I will sit down with my legal team and clarify your confusion. Are we understood?" Eve held the folder against her chest. "And if I go to the authorities?" Callum smiled. It was the worst smile she had ever seen. "Eve, I own buildings in 14 states. I have relationships with every agency that could investigate me. I have a security team that handles problems far more complicated than a nervous accountant. Don't make yourself a problem." Eve left his office. She drove home. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 20 minutes. Her hands were shaking. Her phone buzzed 3 times, all from numbers she didn't recognize. At 1:14 a.m., she looked out her apartment window and saw a black SUV parked across the street. The engine was running. The headlights were off. A man sat in the driver's seat, watching her building. She knew his face. Teddy Worley, head of Horton's private security, a former military contractor who had worked for Callum for 11 years. Eve did not call the police. She had heard what Callum said about his relationships with agencies. She did not call her mother. She did not call Noor. She packed one bag. She took the fireproof safe from under her bed. She left her phone on the kitchen counter. She knew it could be tracked. She left her car in the garage. She knew it had GPS. She walked out the back entrance of her building at 2:30 a.m., carrying a duffel bag in one hand and an $89 fireproof safe in the other. She walked 14 blocks to the Broad Street bus station and bought a one-way ticket to Philadelphia with cash. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. She didn't look back. Eve Vega vanished. But before she left, before she packed the bag, before she walked out the back door, she did one thing nobody would discover for 2 years. She mailed a copy of everything, every document, every spreadsheet, every wire transfer record, sealed in a box, sent by certified mail, addressed to a name she had found through 3 hours of research on a library computer. FBI Special Agent Colin Farr, Financial Crimes Division, Newark Field Office. The box arrived at the FBI 4 days later. It sat in an intake queue for 6 weeks. Then someone opened it. Eve Vega spent the first 3 months in Philadelphia. She stayed at a women's shelter on North Broad Street under a false name. She told them she was fleeing domestic violence. It was close enough to the truth. She moved 4 times in the first year: Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond, Roanoke. She paid cash. She worked under the table, cleaning houses, washing dishes, folding laundry at a hotel. She never used a credit card. She never logged into an email. She never called home. Jenny and Noor reported her missing after 2 weeks of silence. Newark PD opened a missing persons case. It went nowhere. Eve had left no trail. After 4 months, the case was reclassified as a suspected homicide. Detectives theorized she had been killed by an unknown assailant. There was no body, no evidence, just absence. Noor held a memorial service at the church on South Orange Avenue. 30 people came. Jenny sat in the front row and did not speak. She held a framed photograph of Eve's college graduation and would not let go of it. Meanwhile, FBI Special Agent Colin Farr was building a case. The box Eve had mailed contained 347 pages of financial documents, 4 USB drives, and a handwritten letter. The letter began, "My name is Eve Vega. I am the chief accountant of Horton Development Group." The enclosed documents prove that Callum Horton has been laundering approximately $200 million in federal grant money through shell corporations. I am sending this because I believe my life is in danger and I may not be able to testify. If I am unable to appear, these documents should speak for me. Colin Farr read the letter. He read the documents. He started an investigation. He did not tell Callum Horton. He did not tell the Newark PD. He built the case the way Eve built the spreadsheet, quietly, methodically, one wire transfer at a time. It took 18 months. Colin subpoenaed bank records. He traced the shell companies. He identified the offshore accounts. He flipped a mid-level employee at Horton Development who confirmed the invoicing scheme. He took everything to a federal grand jury. The indictment was sealed. 23 counts: money laundering, wire fraud, federal grant fraud, conspiracy. Colin Farr had one problem. His star witness was missing, possibly dead. The documents alone were strong, but a jury needed a face, a voice, someone who could walk them through the numbers. Then, on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 2 years and 4 days after she vanished, Eve Vega walked into the FBI's Newark field office carrying an $89 fireproof safe and asked to speak with Agent Colin Farr. "I believe you have my documents," she said. Colin stared at her. "We thought you were dead." "I wasn't dead. I was waiting for you to be ready." Real quick pause and drop a comment below. Tell me if you have ever been in a situation where you had to disappear from your own life just to survive. Share your thoughts, because this community is built on people who refuse to be silenced. Eve's return was not public. Colin Farr placed her in a secure location and spent 3 weeks preparing her testimony. She walked him through every document, every account, every transaction. She drew the money trail on a whiteboard, starting with federal grants, through HUD disbursement, into Horton's project accounts, out through fake invoices, into shells, through offshore banks, and back into Horton's personal trust. "You did this alone?" Colin asked. "I did this at night on a personal laptop with a $12 flash drive from Walgreens. His security team had access to every company device. I never touched the company network. And you mailed us everything before you disappeared. I didn't know if I would survive. I needed the evidence to survive even if I didn't." Colin assigned a federal prosecutor. They contacted Jacob Sears, a civil rights and white-collar attorney who had been retained by the Vega family after Eve's disappearance. Jacob had been pursuing a wrongful death suit against Horton, arguing that Horton's private security team was involved in Eve's disappearance. The suit had been going nowhere. Horton's legal team, led by Marcus Levins, had buried it in the same procedural warfare that billionaires always use: delay, deny, destroy. When Jacob learned Eve was alive, he drove to the FBI office in Newark and sat across from her for 2 hours. "They held a memorial for you," Jacob said. "I know. Your mother hasn't left the house in 6 months." Eve pressed her hand flat against the table. Her jaw was tight, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "I know that too, and I need you to understand something. I didn't leave because I was afraid of Callum Horton. I left because if I stayed, his people would have found the evidence before the FBI could build the case. My apartment would have been searched. The safe would have been taken. Every document would have disappeared. I had to choose between my family knowing where I was and the evidence surviving long enough to put him in prison." She paused. "I chose the evidence, and I will live with that for the rest of my life." If you love your mom, you need to subscribe right now, because at the end of this video, I am revealing one secret that nobody in that courtroom understood. There is a reason Callum Horton's own security chief walked into the FBI the night before the trial. And when I show you what he brought with him, you will realize this man had been building his own escape plan for years. Trust me, the secret is worth it. The trial of United States versus Horton Development Group opened in the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey. 23 counts, federal prosecution, FBI case. The courtroom was packed, press in the first 3 rows, HUD officials observing. Representatives from 6 tenant advocacy organizations who had been fighting Horton's buildings for years. Buildings with broken elevators, no heat, lead paint, and plumbing that hadn't been inspected since construction. Callum Horton sat at the defense table in a $7,000 suit. Marcus Levins sat beside him with 4 associates. The defense team looked polished, prepared, and expensive. They looked like they had done this before. Eve Vega sat behind the prosecution table. She wore a dark gray dress and flat shoes. She had lost weight. Her hair was shorter, but her eyes were the same eyes that had read 7 years of fraudulent invoices and never looked away. Noor sat behind her. Jenny sat beside Noor. Jenny held the same framed photograph she had held at the memorial. She had not let go of it. Judge Carrie Mosley entered. She was 54, precise, and ran her courtroom with the expectation that everyone in the room had done their homework. Opening statements. The federal prosecutor stood first. "Your Honor, this case is about a simple theft committed on a massive scale. Callum Horton took $200 million in federal housing grants, money designated for low-income families, for buildings with working heat and clean water and safe elevators, and laundered it through shell companies into his personal accounts. He did this for 5 years. He used fake construction invoices, Delaware shells, and offshore accounts. And when his own accountant discovered the scheme and confronted him, she was forced to flee for her life. She spent 2 years in hiding. She is here today, and the evidence she preserved is in those 3 boxes." Marcus Levins stood. "Your Honor, Ms. Vega is a disgruntled former employee who left the company under unclear circumstances. The financial structure she's describing are standard real estate development practices: multi-entity accounting, cost allocation, subcontractor management. The prosecution is asking this jury to criminalize complexity." Judge Mosley nodded. "We'll hear from the government's first witness." The United States calls Eve Vega. Eve walked to the stand. She sat down. She looked at the jury, 8 women, 4 men. She looked at Callum Horton. He looked back at her. His expression was blank, controlled, the expression of a man who had been told by his attorneys to show nothing. "Ms. Vega, what was your role at Horton Development Group?" "I was the chief accountant for 7 years." "During that time, did you discover financial irregularities?" "Yes. Beginning in my 3rd year, I identified a pattern of inflated construction invoices on federally funded housing projects. The invoices listed subcontractors that did not exist. The payments flowed through shell companies registered in Delaware into offshore accounts and back into a domestic trust controlled by Mr. Horton." "How much money was laundered through this scheme?" "Approximately $200 million over 5 years. Marcus Levins stood. "Objection. The witness is characterizing the transactions as laundering. That's a legal conclusion. Judge Mosley looked at Eve. Ms. Vega, please describe the transactions. The jury will determine the characterization. Eve nodded. Federal grant money entered Horton Development's project accounts. Invoices were created for construction work performed by companies that had no employees, no physical addresses, and no construction licenses. Payments were wired to those companies. The money was then moved through 2 offshore bank accounts, one in the Cayman Islands, one in Luxembourg, and returned to a domestic trust in Mr. Horton's name. She opened a binder. Page 1 shows the first transaction I identified, a payment of $3.2 million to a company called Broadfield Partners, LLC, for electrical work on the Trenton Commons project. Broadfield Partners was registered in Delaware on January 14th and dissolved on March 3rd. It existed for 48 days. It had no employees. The electrical work was actually performed by a licensed contractor named Atlas Electric, who was paid $1.1 million. The difference, $2.1 million, went through the shell and into Mr. Horton's trust. She turned the page. Page 2 shows the same pattern on the Camden project. Page 3, the Patterson project. Page 4, Elizabeth. I have documentation for 14 projects across 5 states. She looked at the jury. I documented every transaction. I matched every invoice to a shell company. I traced every wire transfer. I didn't do this on company time. I did it at night on my own laptop because I knew that if anyone at the company found out, the evidence would be destroyed. And I was right. Because when I told Mr. Horton what I found, he didn't deny it. He threatened me. What did he say? He told me not to make myself a problem. He said he had a security team that handles problems far more complicated than a nervous accountant. The courtroom shifted. 2 jurors wrote notes. 1 juror looked directly at Callum Horton. Callum's expression didn't change, but his hand, resting on the table, closed into a fist. Marcus Levins rose for cross-examination. He was aggressive. Ms. Vega, you vanished for 2 years. No contact with law enforcement. No contact with your family. Your own mother thought you were dead. Is that correct? Yes. And you expect this jury to believe that a grown woman with a CPA license and access to law enforcement simply chose to disappear rather than call the police? I mailed the evidence to the FBI before I left. Every document. I sent it because I didn't know if I would survive long enough to testify. And yet here you are, alive, unharmed. Because I ran. If I had stayed, I would be dead. The same way 2 former employees of Mr. Horton's companies reported harassment from his security team after raising internal concerns. One moved out of state. The other withdrew her complaint after her car was vandalized 3 times in 2 weeks. Marcus paused. He hadn't expected that. Move to strike. The witness is testifying about events she has no direct knowledge of. Your Honor, the prosecutor stood. The incidents are documented in Exhibit 38, former employee complaints filed with the Newark Police Department. Judge Mosley looked at Marcus. Overruled. The exhibits are in evidence. Continue, Ms. Vega. Eve turned back to the jury. I didn't disappear because I was running from the law. I disappeared because I was running from him. She looked at Callum. And I came back because the case was ready. The FBI built it. I survived. And now the evidence is here, all of it. If you are still watching, you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next episode, because this exact pattern of money laundering and witness intimidation shows up in another billionaire real estate case I am covering soon. And the disappearing witness strategy Eve used here becomes even more important in that story. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Callum Horton guilty on all 23 counts: money laundering, wire fraud, federal grant fraud, conspiracy. He was sentenced to 17 years in federal prison. Horton Development Group was ordered to pay $214 million in restitution, the laundered amount plus penalties. But here's the detail I told you to wait for. the secret nobody in that courtroom understood. The night before the trial began, a man walked into the FBI's Newark field office and asked to speak with Agent Colin Farr. His name was Teddy Worley, the head of Callum Horton's private security team, the man who had parked the black SUV outside Eve's apartment the night she fled. Teddy brought a laptop. On the laptop were 11 years of internal security logs. Every surveillance assignment Horton had ever ordered. Every person his team had followed, photographed, or intimidated. Every phone that had been monitored. Every apartment that had been entered, including Eve Vega's. "I went to her apartment the night she left," Teddy told Colin. "Horton sent me to retrieve a safe he said contained stolen company property. When I got there, the apartment was empty. She was gone. The safe was gone. Why are you coming forward now?" "Because I'm on the witness list. Defense or prosecution, somebody is going to put me on that stand. And when they do, I'm not lying for him. Not anymore." Teddy's logs revealed something the prosecution hadn't known. Callum Horton hadn't just sent Teddy to Eve's apartment. He had sent teams to 3 other people. A former project manager who had questioned invoicing irregularities, a HUD inspector who had flagged a cost discrepancy in the Camden project, and a journalist who had been researching Horton's shell companies for a story that was never published. All 3 had been surveilled. One had received anonymous threats. The journalist's apartment had been broken into and her laptop stolen. The FBI opened a secondary investigation. 2 of Teddy's former team members were indicted on federal stalking and obstruction charges. Callum Horton's sentence was later enhanced by 3 years after the intimidation evidence was presented in a separate hearing. Eve Vega was not one of Callum Horton's victims. She was the one who got away. Because she ran before the door closed, and she mailed the evidence before she disappeared, the $89 safe kept her documents dry. The $4.50 certified mail receipt kept the FBI honest, and 2 years of silence kept her alive. Eve Vega moved back to New Jersey 3 months after the trial, not to Newark. She rented a small apartment in Montclair, 12 minutes from her mother's house. The first night home, she sat at Jenny's kitchen table. Noor was there. The framed photograph from the memorial was still on the shelf by the window. Jenny hadn't moved it. "I'm sorry," Eve said. Jenny reached across the table and took Eve's hand. She held it the way she had held the photograph, tight, quiet, like she was afraid to let go. "I knew," Jenny whispered. "You knew what?" "I knew you weren't dead. Mothers know." Something in here, she pressed her other hand to her chest, never stopped waiting. Noor leaned forward. "I was so angry at you. For 2 years I was furious." "I know. And now I'm angry at him, for making you choose." The 3 women sat at the table in silence for a long time. The kind of silence that only family can hold. Heavy, honest, and unbroken. Eve returned to accounting, not at a corporation. She opened a 1-person forensic accounting practice in Newark, specializing in grant fraud audits for nonprofit housing organizations. Her first 3 clients were tenant advocacy groups who had fought Horton's buildings for years and never had the financial evidence to prove what they already knew. She gave them the evidence. Colin Farr was promoted to supervisor of the Financial Crimes Division. Teddy Worley received a reduced sentence for cooperation and entered witness protection. Marcus Levins was investigated by the bar for his role in shielding Horton during the civil litigation, but was not disbarred. Callum Horton is serving 17 years at a federal facility in Pennsylvania. His name has been removed from every building he developed. The low-income housing projects he used as money laundering vehicles are being transferred to community land trusts. New elevators are being installed. Heat is being repaired. Lead paint is being removed. The buildings are finally becoming what they were always supposed to be. Eve Vega's fireproof safe sits in her office in Newark. She never moved the documents out of it. She keeps it under her desk, where she can see it every day. On the lid, written in permanent marker in her own handwriting, are 2 words: "For proof." Callum Horton had $5.1 billion. He had a security team. He had lawyers. He had relationships with agencies. He had the power to make people disappear. Not by killing them, but by making their lives so dangerous that running felt like the only choice. Eve Vega had a fireproof safe, a $4.50 postage receipt, and the memory of every number she had ever read. She didn't have power. She had precision. She built the case alone. She mailed it before she ran. She hid for 2 years in shelters and spare rooms and church basements, working under false names, never calling home, never knowing if the FBI had opened her box or thrown it away. She came back not because it was safe. She came back because the case was ready. Some people fight power with more power. Eve Vega fought it with arithmetic, with dates and account numbers and wire transfer confirmations, and one handwritten letter that said, "If I am unable to appear, these documents should speak for me." The documents spoke, and the jury listened. If this story stayed with you, remember this: the truth doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be powerful. It just needs to survive. And sometimes, all it takes to survive is one person who cares enough to write it down, seal it in a box, and trust that somebody, somewhere, will open it. Somebody opened it. Click the video on your right to see the 3 other corporate espionage cases where self-representation destroyed billion-dollar companies, the legal loopholes they exploited, and the one statute that changes everything. You will see the patterns these strategists use, the mistakes their opponents make, and the exact moment when the trap closes.